The session started. Can I have some quiet in the room, please? Thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I hope that you're finding this summit to be interesting, informative, but also okay. Can everyone hear me now? I've got it as close as I possibly can. Can you hear me now? Great, thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you're finding this Stand Up to Racism International Summit to be interesting, informative, but also practical, because the idea is that we go away from today and organise rather than simply having a talking shop. My name is Brian Richardson, and it's a real privilege for me to be hosting what is going to be a very special session within this conference, and I am particularly delighted to be joined on stage by the mother of the House of Commons, who also, much more importantly, happens to be the president of Stand Up to Racism. More importantly is that the president of Stand Up to Racism, Diane Abbott, the MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington. Diane, welcome. And congratulations on the publication of your book, which we have here, A Woman Like Me. And Diane, I'm going to begin by inviting you, if you'd like, to read an extract from the book.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Okay, this is from the first chapter, which has the title, The Early Years. And on that very first page, there's a lovely photograph of me at my little brother's christening. So let me read the first couple of paragraphs. One of the first photographs of me was taken by a professional photographer at my younger brother Hugh's christening, which took place in 1954, almost a year after my own. My mother always swore that she had named me after a singer in the church choir, but I'm sure my name had more to do with her own mother, to whom she was very attached, Dinah Dale, my maternal grandmother, who was known to everybody as Miss Di. And although she never left the Jamaican countryside, Miss Di made her impact felt. She was a charismatic woman and an adored parent, and was hugely respected in her community. And I think if I'm as respected today as my grandmother was all those years ago, I will have done well.
Diane, I want to begin both with that absolutely fabulous photograph, but also more generally with the picture that you paint of that period, because I think one of the things, and I really resonate with this, that is fascinating is the way in which you talk about the Windrush generation, which your parents were a part of, as were mine, and how it was that for them, there was no contradiction in being from their own islands, but also, as they saw it, proud to be British and regarded Britain as the mother country. And I wonder whether you could just explore that idea a little bit.
The Caribbean is a region of migration. I have uncles and aunts in America, particularly Florida. A lot of Jamaicans went to Florida initially to pick vegetables and fruit. Some went to Canada, but probably the largest number went to the UK. And both my mother and father, who came here separately, they weren't married at that time, they were born and brought up in a little village in Clarendon in Jamaica. And my mother came here on a boat. It wasn't the Windrush, but it was a boat. My father came on an aeroplane, which was very unusual for that generation of migrant. It shows that, like his daughter, he was quite daring. Anyway, they were both in London, West London, Paddington, Ladbroke Grove. Now, Ladbroke Grove is really quite posh, but back in the day, in the 50s, it wasn't posh at all, and a lot of West Indian migrants lived there. But they were there separately, didn't know each other were there. And my father was walking down the street and somebody said to him, "Guess who's here?" And he said, and they said, "Little Lucille," which is my mother's pet name. Anyway, they joined up together again and got married. So my father bought a house. And you're all saying, how could a working class black man in the 50s buy a house? How did that happen? Well, first of all, that generation of Caribbean migrants had to buy a house. Because in the 50s and early 60s, councils just would not house black people. There was no race relations legislation. They could just say to you, "We're not housing you, you weren't born here," whatever excuse. So there's a whole generation of Caribbean migrants who bought houses. Daddy bought a house in Paddington, but every room was let separately because how else are you going to pay the mortgage? And we had an Irish family in the basement, though, who were sitting tenants. Anyway, this was the 50s, and you had Teddy Boys, and you had the National Front. And my mother always tells a story. There was one evening, really, and I think it was Teddy Boys or fascists of some kind going up our street. It was called Edbrook Road. It was off the Harrow Road. Going up our street and knocking on every door. And if they found it was a black family in the house, they would abuse them and sometimes physically attack them. And I think they were 2 doors away from us. Now, the Irish family in the basement, they were led by Uncle Jimmy. And I still remember him. And the point about Uncle Jimmy was, in the morning, my mother would give me my breakfast. And then she would take me downstairs to Uncle Jimmy and he'd give me another breakfast. I don't think he'd ever had to engage, well, he'd never engaged with a black baby before, and he was completely enraptured with me. Anyway, so the racists are going up the road, and we were kind of in the house, kind of listening and not knowing what to do, really. And Uncle Jimmy came up from the basement, and he said, "They are not getting our Diane." So they knocked on the door. He opened their door. They saw a white man there. They thought he owned the house and they went away. But the thing to remember about those black communities in the 50s and 60s, whether it was West London, whether it was Brixton, they were always on the edge of difficulty and violence.
And so that was an extraordinary escape that you had, and that's a story that encapsulates that whole experience of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, and the hostility that people faced. And yet at the same time, there was a pride, wasn't there, in the sense that people were coming and part of the mother country. And of course, that was something that when we talk about the Windrush scandal, was something that came back to bite people many decades later, wasn't it?
The point about the Caribbean, certainly, as I say, it was a region of migration, but they thought of Britain as the mother country. And they migrated, so as we said, many of them to Britain. And on the one hand, they had a fierce pride in their culture. whether it was the food or the drink or just talking. I remember every weekend my parents would meet up with. We moved out of Paddington at one point, but every weekend we'd come back to Paddington, West London, Kilburn, and so that Mummy could buy yam and sweet potato and green banana to cook, but also so we could meet up again with friends and family. And they didn't talk about Jamaica. They always talked about home. It was always home. And most of those people actually died in this country, but for them, the Jamaica was home, and they had a fierce pride in their culture and their food and their music. But they're also very proud to be British. And I can remember my family had a picture of the Queen, I think, in our living room. So they combined the two things. They combined a pride in their culture, but a pride in being British. And when they came across, they would have traveled on passports which said they were citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. In effect, until the early 60s, you had complete freedom of movement between colonies and this country. So as far as they knew, they were British. And this is why the Windrush scandal was a shock, but also very upsetting for them. They come here thinking they were British. Now, years later, they were challenged as to their nationality and found that they couldn't use the health service, couldn't come in and out of the country and so on. But the point about Windrush was not just that it was awful. It's not just that people weren't getting what they were entitled to. It was a huge shock to a generation that in a fundamental sense thought of the Queen as their queen and thought of themselves as British.
Diane, there is so much that we could talk about in the book, but what I'm going to do is we're going to fast forward, and we're going to fast forward to 1987. I remember it particularly. I remember where I was on election night in 1987 because it was the very first election I ever voted in. It was a pretty miserable night at Manchester University as we watched the results come in and see that the Tories were going to get in with another huge majority. But there was one glimmer of hope, and it came in the news that 4 Black MPs had been elected: Bernie Grant, Paul Boateng, Keith Vaz, and Diane Abbott. What was that like?
Well, it was quite extraordinary. The first thing to remember is that a lot of people thought you couldn't elect Black MPs because there had been at least 2 attempts by the Labour Party to run a Black MP. I think they ran a man called Lord David Pitt. Well, he was not Lord then, David Pitt. And I think it was Hampstead and Highgate. And it was meant to be a safe Labour seat, and he lost. There was a man called Russell Prophet, who was a teacher, and he ran in Lewisham and he lost. So there was a kind of sense that it was a bit daring to run a Black person, even in a safe seat, and, you know, could they really win? I was selected in Hackney. I could talk. Oh. I was selected in Hackney after a lot of trials and tribulations. But I'll tell one story about the selection night. Because again, no one thought I was going to win the selection. There was a perfectly good sitting MP called Ernie Roberts. There was the leader of Hackney Council who thought she was going to be his heiress. Anyway, the night of the actual selection, I had to wait outside Hackney in the corridors outside the council chamber in order to go in and make my selection speech. And Hackney, as many of you will know, between the wars in particular, was a very Jewish area. And along the corridors outside the council chamber were photographs of past mayors in the 30s and 40s and so on. And most of those mayors were actually Jewish. So I was pacing up and down in the corridor waiting to be called in to give my speech. And I was very nervous. It would have been my fourth or fifth selection, and I was very nervous. Anyway, but it was, I'll never forget, I was walking up and down the corridors, and it was as if I could hear all these Jewish mayors whispering to me. They were whispering to me. And what they whispered was, we were migrants, we did it, and you will do it too. So I'm going to quickly get to election night. But I remember giving my speech at the selection conference. Now, the point is that almost all of the delegates were actually mandated to vote for somebody else. And I gave my speech, and it couldn't have been a bad speech because I could see people struggling. And what they were struggling with was the fact they were mandated to vote for somebody else, but listening to me, they realized they had to vote for me. And I always remember the final lines of my speech, which were some lines of verse from a Black American female poet, Maya Angelou. And the lines of verse, which I can remember nearly 40 years later, were this: bearing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And I won the selection. And I'll just say one more thing about that. There was a party official who was like officiating. And when I won, which was a big shock because people were mandated to vote for all types of other people. When I won, the party official kind of turned white. And he said, if we had known you were going to win, we would have done something. So nothing has changed between the party bureaucracy and me. Anyway, it was a very lively campaign. We had bricks through our office window and all the rest of it. But so on election night, it just felt incredible. You know, around London, my colleagues were being elected, but Black MPs had never been elected before. And it just felt quite incredible. It felt sort of seismic, really. My mum was there, my brother was there, and of course, all my supporters, the people who had worked to get me elected, were there. And we were all very pleased and proud. I don't think any of us, talking about my party members and my supporters who I still see, I don't think any of us will forget how we felt that night.
So now, Diane, as I said at the outset, you're now the mother of the house, which means that you're the longest serving, consistent, unbroken, the longest unbroken period of service by any woman in the House of Commons now, which is an extraordinary achievement. You've done many things, obviously, in that time, but I think for me that there are two things that particularly stand out. I think I first met you at one of those extraordinary conferences that you held around schools and the Black child. And the other big issue, I think, has been around reparations. Starting with education, why in particular has that been a touchstone issue for you?
I have always been, before I ever became an MP or a councillor, in fact, I've always been very involved in Black community politics. And one of the huge issues for me has always been what happens to our children, particularly our Black boys in schools. Because I think, in particular for our boys who had and continue to have totally disproportionate levels of exclusion. I've never forgotten, it was the Director General of the Prison Service, whose name I have forgotten, in fact.
Martin Leary?
Yes. And he said, he wasn't some big time liberal, he was just, addressing the facts. He said, on the day that you exclude a child from school, you might as well give them a date and time to turn up at prison. It's that school to prison pipeline. So on the one hand, I was very fortunate with my education. I was one black girl in my primary school, passed my 11 plus. I was one black girl in my girls' grammar school, went on to Cambridge. I was the one black girl in Newnham College, Cambridge, and so on, right? But because I had been reasonably fortunate, I could see how at every level, working class children and black children were kept out of Britain's education system. I've always felt that education was very important. So as you say, for some years, when Ken Livingstone was mayor, in fact, I ran conferences called London School and the Black Child. Sadly, Boris Johnson became mayor and he wasn't interested in funding conferences of that kind.
Well, I mean, just on that, and they were called London, originally Hackney Schools and the Black Child, then London Schools and the Black Child, but it was clear attending them, these were national events, weren't they? People came from all over the country, and it really busted that myth that black families are not interested in education. Actually, there was a real commitment precisely because people could see that that was a way in which their children could get forward and get ahead, wasn't it? That was what really struck me about those. The other question was about reparations, why reparations has been such an important issue for you. And it's obviously a very topical issue right now, isn't it?
Well, reparations is a very important issue. And it's not just the money. And in the end, reparations may not be about money as such. It's about this country recognizing how much it made, how much it gained, how much it was enriched by slavery. Because in recent times, people just want to talk about how, Wilberforce freed the slaves and all the rest of it. The truth is that much of the money that was invested in the Industrial Revolution came from the profits of slavery. You can go all over the country, even today, and see stately homes which were paid for by the profits of slavery. And, slaveholders got compensation. The slaves didn't get a penny.
Diane, I'm going to ask you one last question before opening up for some questions from the floor. And again, we're fast forwarding right to very, very recent times. You've had that unbroken period of service as an MP, but there was obviously a very real possibility that that wasn't going to happen because there was a very real possibility that you were not going to be selected as the Labour candidate in the election that we had earlier this year. And you talk about the suspension and possible removal of you as the MP in the book. And so I'm going to invite you to just pick up on that particular issue, because that must have been a real shock. And particularly given that the allegation was that, somehow you weren't taking the issue of racism seriously, or were indeed perhaps even being racist yourself. That must have been a particular dagger to your heart.
You said just now that I was Britain's longest serving female MP. And I would say that was no thanks to Keir Starmer. There's a lot I could say, but just to condense it, one of the things that Keir Starmer prides himself on is that he's cleared the left out of the party, both at a rank and file level in ordinary party members. The membership has dropped under him. It's dropped quite sharply. And that's partly the left-wingers that he's got rid of. And of course, the first thing he did was clear Jeremy out of the party, which was extraordinary. Whenever you think about Jeremy, he's one of the longest serving MPs. He had been leader of the party. You can't imagine the Tories throwing out a former leader of their party, not even Liz Truss. So yeah, they got rid of Jeremy, and then they got around to me, and what they did is they used stuff as a pretext, suspended me for a very long period of time. And they kept saying there's an investigation going on, but of course the investigation had halted. They were lying, yeah, thank you. But the reason they prolonged the investigation, and those of you who are party members will understand this, if they had admitted that the investigation was over and I was no longer going to be a Labour candidate, then my party, which was and remains a left party, would have selected another left candidate. And they didn't want that. So what they were trying to do is drag it out until the election is called, and they can just parachute in anybody they want. That's what that was all about. So it was extraordinary to be accused of racism, not least by people who themselves were not shining white examples of anti-racism. And at one point, they wanted to do a deal. They were determined to get rid of me and they wanted to do a deal. And they said to me that they would restore the whip if I would promise to stand down as an MP in the next few hours. Literally the next few hours, not the next day, not the next week, but by the end of the day. And I turned down their deal. My view was if they wanted to get rid of me, they were going to have to do it. I was going to make it easy for them. And in the end, Starmer had to back off. And it was because of pressure from the community, tremendous pressure from the community. And you know, people try to talk to him and his boys and say, look, this isn't really going to work for you. You need to, but no, they kept on, and almost to the last minute before he was prepared to say that he was going to allow me to stand. And so I was very proud once again to stand in my 10th general election and become the Labour MP for Hackney and Stone.
And I think, I know I said I will open it up, but I think it is important that you are very frank and honest in the book in admitting that the letter that you had sent, for which you were then suspended, that it was a mistake. You apologize for it, and you very, very clearly set out in the book your position in terms of not believing there's some kind of hierarchy on the question of people suffering racism and discrimination, don't you? And I think it's very important that you set that record straight in the book, don't you?
Well, I mean, I repeat the facts, which is that the letter was a mistake. I apologized within hours. And if anybody, you know, if anybody believes I'm a racist, that's up to them. But it was all used as a pretext to get rid of me, which is what they wanted to do all along. And I would add this, when I kind of toughed out Starmer and his boys, and actually they had to allow me to stand, there's a number of comrades on the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party who were very grateful, because they believed if they had been successful in getting rid of me, they would have cleared out the remaining left-wingers in the Parliamentary Labour Party.
And I'm delighted actually that one of your proteges, Bel Ribeiro Addy, became my MP in 2019. Let's pick a pick up a couple of questions from the floor. Sister.
Hi, Diane, and thank you. My name is June Lewis. I'm here representing International Decade for People of African Descent, the United Nations Initiative. Reparations. Let's put that on the agenda again. You fought at the beginning. Are you going to carry on and have a conversation about getting us some kind of recognition? I agree with you, it's not money, but they could open up the archives and give us back our history and things like that. So where is the Labour Party now on reparations? Thank you.
Well, I can't speak for Keir Starmer, but I never can. All I can say is that my colleague, the member for Clapham and Brixton Hill, Bell Ribeiro Addy, had a big conference on reparations, actually. I think it was 2 weeks ago. And she's this weekend is in Berlin talking to people who have archives about slavery. So we're just continuing to soldier on. You know, one of the first people in Parliament to raise the issue of reparations was actually Bernie Grant. And it kind of didn't get much focus, but for several years, but partly because of the work of people in the community and someone like Bell, it has now gone high up the agenda. And Keir Starmer is saying that he's not gonna pay any reparations. But guess what? Just as he had to back off getting rid of me, maybe he'll have to back off saying he won't pay reparations.
Good afternoon, Diane. You're such a legend. Thank you so much. I'm so nervous. My name's Debbie Allen. I email you all the time with my lived problems. Guys, I want you to know I am co-convener for West London Stand Up to Racism, and Raj is one of our supporters. First of all, racism is alive and kicking today. Okay, I've got the monitoring group supporting me with dog walkers, 7 different people in the last few weeks who allowed their dogs to foul outside my home. So forget about me. You're from Clarendon. My parents are from Twixside in Maypen, and it's a little place on a hill where taxis don't take you. If anyone's seen the Jamaican film, I've forgotten the name of it now, but the taxi, they take your money and say they're going to take you, then they leave you at the bottom of the road. So it's nice to meet a fellow Clarendonian. I want to ask, what has happened to the Ford report, number 1? Number 2, will you leave a Diane Abbott program for Black women so that we can see more representation in the House of Commons? Will reparations, I'm sorry, for me is about money, because we haven't got back our archives or our bones or other historical things that they are holding on to, and healing is expensive. When we are race weathered, it is so difficult to find mental health support that specifically deals with race weathering. And that's my question. How have you managed your mental health after all the abuse from the party? We are conditioned to vote Labour, and I just don't know how you done it. So could you share some secrets on mental health?
Well, I would say 3 things. I've been fortunate to have a good group of women friends who over the 37, 38 years have been a great support. And many of them aren't in party politics at all, which is good, because when you get worked out about something, they can put it all in perspective. And I've got one, because sometimes you can get very upset and depressed about what happens to you. And I've got one friend, she's white, in fact, I think she may be Irish. Anyway, Annie. Annie always says, if you're working class and you become an MP, it's the job your parents always wanted for you. Clean, indoor work, no heavy lifting. So one thing that's helped me is reminding myself that I could be a lot worse off. And also, you know, as I think I said at the beginning, it took extraordinary resilience to leave deep rural Jamaica to come to London in the 50s. And I like to think I've inherited some of that resilience.
Unfortunately, I can take only one last question, and then, Diane, we're going to need to wrap up. In wrapping up, I do want to give you an opportunity to pick up on two things that you won't have had an opportunity to talk about in the book, one of which is those outrageous riots that we saw at the beginning of the summer here, and the other, even more recently than that, the election of Trump in America and the implications that you think that there are from that. But there was one last question before I hand over to you, and apologies to everyone else who would have liked to speak. Diane is going to be doing a bit of a signing of just a few books. There are going to be other events around the country where there are launches, and you'll have an opportunity to get a signed copy of the book. So apologies if you can't do that today. You will get a bit of an opportunity to talk to Diane at the end of the session.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you so much. It's been wonderful to hear you speak today to this conference. My question, I raise the question as a Jewish member of Stand Up to Racism. Would you say that what worries me is that the attempt to get rid of you and of Jeremy actually testifies perhaps to an anxiety on the part of the official leadership, Keir Starmer, of the Jewish community, how they might respond. But actually, what it seems to me to have done is to raise the specter of Jewish power. And that, to me, risks intensifying anti-Semitism in this country. Would you agree?
I think there's a lot in that. I think it's like my Hackney Jewish mayors. They were about Jewish power, even if it was only in the London Borough of Hackney. And I would say this, because a lot of people don't realize this, there's a lot of talk about anti-Semitism in the party, but you know, most of the people that have been expelled from the party for anti-Semitism are actually Jewish, which tells you something. In terms of the riots this summer, one of the things which concerned me was the way Keir Starmer, certainly in the beginning, kept talking about them as thuggery, and that the answer was, you know, a criminal justice answer. He talked about them as thuggery, just like they were just individual episodes of violence. In fact, they were racism. They were racism pure and simple. And he had great difficulty in saying that. And because we as a government, didn't really call out the racism, the worrying thing is we're going to see increasing waves of racism, not just here in Britain, but in Europe. And as most of you will know, in Europe, you've got Italian Prime Minister her party is literally a neo-fascist party. You've got neo-fascist parties doing very well electorally in Germany and in France. And of course, above all, Donald Trump has been elected the president of the United States. And the thing about Donald Trump is that he's not just a kind of regular white racist, which those of us of color in the audience are kind of used to dealing with. He is a white nationalist. He is somebody who utterly despises Black and Hispanic people. And those Black men and Hispanics who were foolish enough to vote for him they are going to find out something. But we're in dark times. Trump as president, the far right on the rise in Europe, and a Labour Prime Minister who, what can I say, has a little difficulty with the issue. That is why a conference like this and an organisation like Stand Up to Racism is so important. So thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you.
Well, everyone, the next session starts at 3:30, so you've got time for a little break. I just want to finish by the ovation is an indication of just how much esteem we hold you in, Diane. It has been a pleasure and a privilege working with you. I know through the years that I've worked with you through Unite Against Fascism and Stand Up to Racism, just how committed you are to this cause. So thank you again. And
Thank you, Diane. Dan, can we just get a quick photo of you with the book, you two, with the book in front of the banner?